Chapter 11. Pursuit. The Dana sisters and Mrs. Strong sat quietly in the jeep, eagerly hoping that Aunt Harriet could recall where she had heard the name Antonio Carmino. Miss Dana thought and thought, but without success. "Even if I did remember," she said, "the name might have nothing to do with this Carmino or his daughter Blanche. I think you girls had better not depend on me for a clue." "The answer probably will come to you in the middle of the night," Mrs. Strong remarked. She smiled. "When the conscious mind is asleep, the subconscious often comes to the forefront." Aunt Harriet laughed. "Tonight when I go to sleep, I'll tell that second mind of mine to get to work." Louise asked Mrs. Strong if she was in a hurry to return home. When she said she was not, the young sleuth suggested that they interview various people in Huntersville to see if anyone could supply information about the Carminos who had lived at Pueblo Lake. "All right," Mrs. Strong agreed. "I suggest you and Jean start with the shopkeepers." The women decided to wait in the jeep, so the girls hopped out and hurried up the street. Their first stop was the barber shop. The man in charge there gave them no help. Next, the sisters went to a market and then to a small department store. None of the people they queried at either place knew as much about the tragedy of Lost Lake as the girls did themselves, or had ever heard the name Carmino. The first break came when Louise and Jean spoke to the town's druggist. He was a middle-aged, rotund man. While he could tell nothing about the inhabitants of Pueblo Lake, he referred the girls to an old-time resident, Mrs. Parker. "She's a widow, lives in the last house on the outskirts of Huntersville to the west," said the kind-faced pharmacist. The Danas thanked him and went out to the street. It was only a short distance to Mrs. Parker's house. The elderly woman herself opened the door when they knocked. She was sweet-faced and friendly, and instantly invited the girls to make themselves comfortable in the living room. During the conversation which followed, they learned that Mrs. Parker was 90 years old, but still robust and clear-thinking. Much to the surprise of the Danas, she did not inquire why the girls had come to call. Instead, she talked volubly about her fine family. Louise and Jean nodded politely as they heard about one son of Mrs. Parker's being a doctor in Seattle, another a lawyer in New York, and that "my baby girl lives here. Yes, my daughter Ruth is mighty good to me," Mrs. Parker went on. "She's a widow and keeps house for me. She's at the market right now. Maybe you saw her. Ruth is tall and slender and real pretty." At last an opening came in the one-sided conversation for Jean to interject the subject of the secret of Lost Lake. "It was dreadful, very dreadful." Mrs. Parker's face grew solemn. "My husband and I came here to live a short while before the landslide because of friends out there. All of them were lost." A tear trickled down the old woman's cheek. Louise and Jean told her they had seen pictures and read accounts of the catastrophe. "It must have been terrible," Louise said sympathetically. "Did you know an Antonio Carmino who lived there?" Jean asked. Mrs. Parker's eyes lighted up. "Indeed I did. He was handsome and very dashing." "He had a family?" Jean pursued the subject. "Oh, my, yes," Mrs. Parker replied. "A very pretty wife and a daughter. Her name was Blanche. I never saw her because she was in New York studying at an art school." "Do you think the woman who lives out at Lost Lake now and is called the Witch could be Blanche Carmino?" Louise inquired. "Possibly," Mrs. Parker answered. "One story has gone around that when Blanche returned from New York after the disaster, she went to pieces entirely and left this area suddenly. No one here knew where she went. Several years later, a strange woman came into town on a horse to shop. She would never give her name, nor say where she lived. I've always suspected the woman was Blanche Carmino, and that she hadn't been able to make a living with her artwork. Suddenly, Louise and Jean recalled the echoing words they had heard. Beautiful artwork. If the Witch of Lost Lake was Blanche Carmino, could she have spoken them? But that echo was deep, Louise reflected, as if it had been a man's voice. Whoever the witch is, said Mrs. Parker, it's generally conceded around here that she's a bit daft. If she is Blanche, no doubt the tragedy affected her mind. That could be the case, said Louise. It's a perfect shame to think of such a thing happening. Yes, it is, the old woman agreed. A nice young girl like that to suffer so much. And it seems to me, from what I hear, that all the folks around here do is annoy Blanche and make fun of her. Louise smiled. Not everybody, she said. Just mischievous youngsters and some thoughtless cowboys. What do you suppose the woman is doing out at Lost Lake? Mrs. Parker asked. That's what my sister and I are trying to find out, Jean replied. We understand she does a lot of digging. Maybe she's hunting for something valuable. You mean those old Indian artifacts? Mrs. Parker asked. Perhaps, Louise answered. On the other hand, the witch may be hunting for something that was buried by the landslide. Like what? Mrs. Parker queried. For nearly a year after that landslide, human vultures were out there digging up everything they could. It was disgusting. Louise and Jean felt they had learned all they could from Mrs. Parker and had stayed long enough anyway. They thanked her profusely for her information and rose to leave. If we ever have a chance to talk to the witch, said Louise at the doorway, we'll certainly try to help her. Bless you for that. Mrs. Parker smiled and waved as the Danas went off down the street. Jean's eyes twinkled. Since Antonio Carmino was a handsome, dashing man, maybe that will help Aunt Harriet's memory. The sisters giggled, and as soon as they saw Miss Dana, put the question to her. Handsome? Dashing? Again, Aunt Harriet thought hard, but finally shook her head. No, even the description doesn't jog my memory. I've concluded that I must have heard of Antonio Carmino by reputation, whoever he is, and that I never met the man. You know, said Jean, heaving a sigh, I'm dying of thirst. Why don't we all have a soda before we start back to the ranch? Good idea, Louise agreed. The group had just stepped away from the Jeep when Louise happened to glance at a car speeding past. Her heart almost stood still. There go the Reinhardts, she exclaimed, and tried to get the license number, but failed. We must chase them, Jean cried out. Aunt Harriet wanted to go for the deputy sheriff and tell him. But we'll lose time, Jean said urgently. After all, those two stole Jubilee. Mrs. Strong was convinced. Jump in, she said. It's bad luck to let a thief out of your sight. The doors of the Jeep were quickly slammed shut, and the chase began. Whether the couple had recognized the Dana girls, or whether they were just in a hurry, the pursuers did not know. In any case, Sam and Sally Reinhardt were now driving at top speed. Don't let them get out of sight, Louise begged. Mrs. Strong drove away from town as fast as she dared. Aunt Harriet, bouncing around as they sped along the rough surface, cried out, We shouldn't be going so fast. The sheriff should be chasing the thieves. End of chapter 11.